Hello and greetings from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Welcome to our Global Dialogue webinar. My name is Liane Henschke, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of the Council. The Tennessee World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting global literacy and international understanding through programs that connect Tennesseans to the world. Our key initiatives include the Distinguished Speaker Series featuring approximately 16 luncheon events each year. We have webinars, Student Leaders Without Borders, and Global Eats. We invite you to visit our website, TNWAC.org, to explore our upcoming programs for October and November 2025. Today is my great pleasure to open this webinar, which features a distinguished panel of speakers moderated by Lieutenant Commander Patrick Ryan, founder and President Emeritus of the Council. Our speakers today are Dr. Amy Sayward, Dr. Thomas Schwartz, Dr. Breck Walker, each bringing exceptional expertise and insights to the discussion. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions and comments during the program. Finally, I encourage you to consider becoming a member or donor of the Council. Your support allows us to continue offering high-quality programs. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Patrick, who will moderate today's discussion. On behalf of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, I thank our panelists, moderator, and all participants for joining us in this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Liane. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to our webinar audience who have taken the time to consider the question of where has U.S. foreign policy gone in the year 2025. 35 years ago, last month, President George H.W. Bush addressed Congress as 500,000 U.S. troops were being mobilized to defend Saudi Arabia and ultimately to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in Operation Desert Storm. In those remarks, he addressed the concept of the New World Order, a vision of a post-Cold War world defined by collective security, international cooperation, and the rule of law to manage global affairs. He envisioned great power partnerships like working with the Soviet Union for common cause in peace and stability. It wasn't far in the yardstick of history before that vision faded into an anarchic community of nations, belligerent Russia, expansionist and adversarial China, fraying alliances, economic combat, mass migration consequences, wars in the Middle East, resurgent terrorist groups and states, and on and on. How will the United States deal with this anarchic situation? As of January 20, 2025, when President Trump was inaugurated, the policy of the United States is America First. It's a formal doctrine that reorients U.S. policy away from global leadership aimed at sustaining a liberal world order and towards a more nationalist, realist approach that judges all foreign and domestic actions by the singular metric of what directly benefits the American people. Key principles of America First are transactional engagement with other nations, including generations-old alliance partners, skepticism of multilateralism, and a preference for unilateral action, protectionist trade, the consequences of Liberation Day and tariff roulette, non-intervention with the caveats for selective use of military force, and a nationalist approach to prioritizing border security. An important example of the National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 7, called Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. It represents a formal and explicit reprioritization of the national security apparatus toward internal threats. The document deserves more consideration and attention, especially as it relates to U.S. foreign policy. So will America First result in America alone? That's a question that many people are looking at as we consider what's happening in the U.S. foreign policy arena. Today, we're pleased to host a panel of distinguished historians who will address some of the issues and consequences of the current U.S. foreign policy agenda. With us today, we have Dr. Thomas Schwartz. He's a professor of history and political science at Vanderbilt University. He's educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard universities, and he's the author of books, The Americas, Germany, John McCloy and the Federal Republic of Germany, Lyndon Johnson in Europe in the Shadow of Vietnam, and Henry Kissinger and American Power, a political biography. We also have with us today Dr. Amy Sayward, a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the new director of its campus American Democracy Project. She recently completed a decade as the executive director of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and she's the author of several books on the United Nations and Tennessee history. Also with us, a member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council board, Dr. Breck Walker. He pursued a 20-year career in international business, law, and finance before turning to academia. For several years, he taught foreign policy courses at Sewanee, the University of the South, and worked as a contract historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense Historical Office, researching and writing on early Pentagon policies in the computer security and cyber areas. Dr. Walker is currently retired, except today, where he will be serving as our interlocutor after presentations by Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Sayward. Dr. Schwartz, thank you again for being with us, and the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pat, and thank you for that sort of overview as well of the issues. I always like to start with a few caveats. I am a historian more than anything else, and that means that I'm very good at predicting the past and not really being able to talk a lot about where we're going, or at least be very humble in my predictions. I'm delighted to be here with Amy, particularly, and Breck, who can challenge and correct anything particularly dumb that I say here, and I will stick very much to my 7 to 8 minutes. I have a timer right here on my desk, and we'll follow it. I'm going to take my presentation, and Pat, you really provided a great overview. I'm going to borrow from Sergio Leone's classic spaghetti Western movie, now almost 60 years old, to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in the Trump foreign policy. I'll reverse the order and start with the ugly, and then go to the bad, and close with the good. So I'm going to start here. The ugly. This is pretty easy. The initial forays of the administration, particularly teasing Canada about becoming the 51st state, maybe because I have a lot of good friends who are Canadians and come from a part of the United States near the Canadian border, I saw this as an enormous forced error in terms of American foreign policy. A ridiculous Trump peculiar tendency to think in terms of real estate and diminish Canadian sovereignty and pride, really, really counterproductive. The same thing goes with talking about seizing Greenland. Denmark's one of our best European allies. It even fought with the United States in Iraq when many other European countries avoided that. How incredibly stupid to pick a fight with Denmark over Greenland. And really, again, a very counterproductive, the type of thing that allowed the United States to be compared with Russia in terms of territorial expansion. Just dumb elements. Finally, seizing the Panama Canal, talking about the Panama Canal in a manner. This turned a legitimate issue, which is the concern about the strategic significance of the canal and the question of Chinese influence, into a reminder of a sad chapter in America's past. And again, I think this was all very ugly stuff, juvenile, reflective of Trump's worst instincts, despite, I think, what was an appreciation of America's hemispheric role. And I'd add to this ugly here also the destruction now of ships coming from Venezuela on the basis of their drug, the possibilities that they're being used by drug cartels. I have no sympathy with the cartels, but I do think the procedures need to be followed here. I also have no sympathy with the Venezuelan government of Maduro, which has, I think, driven that country into the ground, and I think deserves to be outlawed, or at least I could see an element of regime change, but I don't like how the United States is following it. So that's what I would call the ugly. On the bad, I would highlight Liberation Day. The White House orchestrated an announcement of a wide range of tariffs on countries around the world based on an utterly simplistic assessment of the balance of trade with each country. It's my sincere hope that the Supreme Court rules that on this issue, Trump exceeded his powers and that setting tariffs is, as it's very clearly stated in the Constitution, a congressional responsibility. I'm not 100% confident of the case, but it's my hope that the court will rule in that manner. And I should add, I'm hoping the same with birthright citizenship, which is also, I think, an area where the administration has floundered. Today's news carries, for example, the story that the government may well have to subsidize our soybean farmers who have lost their market in China with the money that's been collected from tariffs. This is just bad policy all around. And this aspect of Trump is something that is a particular aspect of his economic nationalism that I think is counterproductive. I'm not an economist, but it seems likely that tariffs will contribute to inflation. And if the Democrats retake the House and the Senate, it will be, I think, a classic case of being hoisted by his own petard in this one, because inflation, I think, will be an important issue in the economy. And I think this is, again, a counterproductive element. The high price of gold also indicates, and the weakness of the US dollar, that the economic uncertainty that Trump has triggered through these measures has been something of a forced error again. On the US and China, I also think this is a most significant challenge we face, that the administration has not developed a policy here. Trump may be trying to get some grand strategic or economic bargain with China, but his policies have damaged relations with parts of the Quad, which is the India, Japan, Australia group that we are using in part to contain China. And this alignment's crucial, I think, in the future. Trump also did not punish China the way he did India on its buying of Russian oil. And I think that double standard also hurt relations with India. So I think there's an element of where I think our policy has been sorely lacking. On the US and Europe and Ukraine, I think it's half bad and half good. Trump has had the impressive achievement of getting Europeans to talk about spending 5% of their gross national product on defense. And I think this is a very good move, because I think Europe's dependency was a very unfortunate byproduct of the long Cold War and the fact that European nations have really lost their sense of the need for spending on defense and security. The early parts of the administration, particularly that disastrous meeting with Zelensky early in the administration and dressing down of the Ukrainians, was horrible, but it seems to have been reversed despite Trump's staging of that strange Alaskan summit with Putin. It does seem like the president is finally coming to his senses on this. And the United States may indeed supply Tomahawk missiles and help the Ukrainians in a way that may be really strategic in defeating the Russian aggression there. Finally, on the good, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. I think Trump may be on the verge of settling the Gaza conflict. Now, I know this is controversial to many, but I think they have, the Trump administration, along with Israel, has set back Iran's nuclear program, which was a major priority and goal of the administration. He's also brought Arab states on board now for the possibility of the agreement on Gaza, and may get the hostages back. And I think there are real possibilities for the Abraham Accords and for dramatic changes in the Middle East. And I think this is a very positive development. Obviously, it's not yet clear it's going to happen, but I guess in my view, the signs are there that this will happen. To the extent there is a Trump doctrine, I do see parallels, oddly enough, with the Nixon period. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who I've written about, wanted to find surrogates for American power in different regions. And I think to some extent, the Trump presidency may be doing something similar, both with Israel, perhaps with also Poland and Ukraine and Europe, and perhaps also in the Far East, although, of course, the president does not seem to have pursued that as effectively. But I do think I'm not as apocalyptic about the American foreign policy that's being conducted, because I do think that in many respects, events could alter things. I'll close with this. The coining of the term America First was actually, surprisingly enough, Woodrow Wilson, who coined it in 1915. And when we think about Woodrow Wilson, we do not think of a nationalist president, but he coined the term, saying out of a selfish spirit, our whole duty at any rate must be summed up in the motto, America First. Wilson had to change, and I think to some extent even Trump may be having to change his policy when he faced by the circumstances and events that the world may present. The United States may be at least articulating a different policy now, but I would not be surprised by the end of the Trump presidency that the pendulum will swing back to the type of engagement in the world that has helped, I think, create an international order over the last half century. Thank you.
Amy, would you like to go ahead and say a few
Yes.
words?
Yes, Tom, thank you very much for those words. I'll start with a similar caveat that I'm a historian. I will also, of course, mention that my views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the views of my institution. I'm speaking in my own personal capacity. And the last time that I had the opportunity to speak with the Tennessee World Affairs Council, you were hosting Daniel Runde, who was making a strong argument that the U.S. could and should regain its prominent role in governing or managing the United Nations and its various international agencies. It was a delight to talk to him. I wrote my dissertation about the World Bank, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, which aren't organizations that most folks are terribly aware of. And he had made an argument that the U.S. really could take a stronger role in the world. It does seem, however, that that moment is probably past. I recently had a colleague who is also a diplomatic historian say to me, how does it feel to see an administration dismantling the organization that you spent your life studying? And so Tom can tell you, I tend to be an optimist at heart. And I said, well, I very much believe that the UN will continue and persist. The United States, over the history of the United Nations, has been sort of in and out of various UN agencies, and they do persist. They may have less funding than they would like, then they would need to carry out sort of the very high idealistic statements that were present at their foundation. But I do think that the United Nations will certainly persist. I had lunch with Pat Ryan, about a month ago, and we were talking about this, and I have spent much of the month trying to sort of scour my brain to come up with the best term to describe our current sort of foreign policy moment. And oddly enough, maybe rather than America first, I went back to the idea of the garrison state. So my advisor, Michael Hogan, who's a diplomatic historian who wrote at length about the Truman administration, spent a lot of time talking about the debates happening in the United States Congress leading up to the National Defense Act of 1947. And he really talked about how those debates were very much debates about the nature of the state. At that point, a New Deal state and then a wartime state that had emerged in the United States to manage, of course, World War II and the Great Depression. And after the end of World War II, a lot of Americans really thought that it was time to roll back the state a bit. They were worried that authority had become too centralized in both Wall Street, that was cooperating very closely with the state during the war, as well as Washington, D.C., which of course had grown significantly in order to wage the Second World War. So Michael Hogan argued that those sort of Jeffersonian populists were deeply concerned that American values and American traditions might be run over by this new national security state that seemed to be evolving. That those Jeffersonian populists were not interested in continuing to see the United States play a very prominent and expensive role in world affairs. They were not interested in seeing the state, the federal government, continue to grow in order to maintain that prominent role. And this was a point that political scientists at the time, Harold Lasswell from Yale, had argued that a garrison state risked a new brand of totalitarianism. That if this New Deal and now national security state continued, that we would face great centralization of power and erosion of American freedoms at home. He also worried that the resources that the military had needed and laid claim to in World War II, that process would sort of continue into a post-war period in which the U.S. would spend so much effort sort of taking care of the world and garrisoning the nation that it would lose the ability to provide well for its citizens and to protect them. This sort of process of state making was set, the New Deal state and the national security state was set in opposition to the notion of basic American values of individualism, of free market competition. Ultimately, of course, prognosticators, it's easy to find prognosticators who ultimately end up on the wrong side of history. But I almost wonder if we might talk about a new type of garrison state. In some ways, those Jeffersonian populists who were opposed to the growth of the federal government and Wall Street in the 1940s, to a certain extent, we certainly hear the term populism applied to the Trump administration and its politics frequently. Perhaps they have become less worried about Washington in some ways, right? We see a concern about Congress, an effort to sort of take some of the power from Congress. I don't think the founding fathers ever imagined that the Office of Management and Budget the OMB would play such a huge role in the federal government. But and certainly sort of concern about whether and how the courts will respond to these various initiatives. I wonder, in some ways, if those Jeffersonian populists think that maybe they have the right person in the executive mansion, and perhaps they're less concerned about the power of the federal government, at least the executive, because they think they might win those battles. They might see the dismantling of key parts of the federal government, especially the regulatory state to which they are opposed. But what they might do in terms of foreign policy over a longer term is, I think, yet to be determined. My colleague from Vanderbilt does such a great job of talking about, in less than 1 year, all of the many, many initiatives we've seen, right? It really a tremendously ambitious effort to shape policy in the Western Hemisphere, Panama, Venezuela, Canada, and Europe, certainly, as well as the Far East. The goal remains a little bit elusive, right? Is there a particular vision or a coherent vision behind this? For my historian self right now, it's probably too early to tell, but certainly there is an effort to do things that seem to address a sense of American grievance coming from those Jeffersonian populists, the sense that too much money goes abroad, whether that's in foreign aid, whether that's in missiles to Ukraine, that more has to be done to protect Americans at home, an American workforce that is anxious about artificial intelligence, technological change, and what jobs may remain for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, moving forward in a highly global and highly competitive market. So I think we see a sense of grievance and an attempt to address the grievances of the majority of Americans who voted for President Trump. But whether that can develop into a coherent policy and vision, I think, is yet to be determined. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Tom. That is a lot of food for thought. And I would say just quickly that I'm so glad that the Tennessee World Affairs Council is having historians talk in a lot of instances about the our foreign policy, because as everyone has already mentioned, there is such a switch from where we have been in the vast majority of the post-World War II world that it's hard to evaluate. I think maybe even impossible to evaluate the Trump administration, for example, without having a decent understanding of what came before and what its successes were and where it failed and so forth, because we do seem to be heading an entirely different direction. So I think historians are vital to the discussion. Hey, but just to ask a few questions, if it's all right, I thought we might quickly go through some of the major diplomatic events that the Trump administration has been involved with and get your all's opinion about it. And also, Tom, if you don't mind, and Amy, talk a little bit about your best guess about where things are heading as well. But in the case of Ukraine, and starting with Ukraine, since the Trump administration has come into power, there seems like there's been a lot of back and forth. I mean, that may be the leitmotif of the Trump diplomatic way, back and forth, back and forth. But early on, President Trump raised hopes that he could get a deal with Putin, and either he was misled or perhaps misread Putin, and those hopes seem to have been dashed. And Trump has gone from a little bit of somebody who wants to find a way to make a deal with Putin to somebody who's taking a much harder line right this second. And then after he takes a harder line, not much happens. The harder line is verbally spoken, but not really carried through on this. So is this method or madness on Trump's part with regard to Ukraine? How would you all evaluate his foreign policy to date? And where do you think we're heading in coming months? Amy, shall we start with you?
Sure. Intentionally or unintentionally, I think that the Putin summit moved Europe much closer to Ukraine and helped sort of consolidate. You saw as soon as that summit was announced, Europeans very quickly sort of coming together and saying, you can't make any deal without Ukraine. So I think in some ways, probably unintentionally, but that first initiative really pushed Europe to a greater solidarity with Ukraine, to think and talk about and even plan what they might do independent even potentially of the United States.
I agree with Amy on that. I do think it had a real catalyzing effect on the Europeans. The problem is, of course, some of the major countries there have real issues there. Say, for example, France, where there doesn't seem to be a prime minister that can stay in power there because of their economic issues and their own divisions. So as much as it pushed Europe together, Europe has its own issues with the rise of populist parties and other things within the divisions in all the major countries, Britain, Germany, and France, and other divisions in the European Union. I do think that there may be things going on now that the president has shifted his rhetoric and discussions, especially this issue with the Tomahawk missiles and the question of sharing intelligence, that may signal something, that may signal a greater willingness to inflict pain on Russia, particularly the targeting refineries, the forcing of the, damaging Russian infrastructure, allowing the Ukrainians to do this. And there is a way in which I do think, and I wouldn't bet the farm on this, but there is a sense that I think the United States is looking to the Europeans, and particularly Ukraine, Poland, so the Eastern Europeans now to mobilize for their defense, and that the United States will sell them the weapons and perhaps also provide the intelligence and then the technical know-how to make them much stronger in dealing with Putin. Now, Putin has obviously been challenging the West with these drones and the rest. And it troubles me, but also I'm hoping that at some point he will hit a red line and will trigger the type of response that gets his attention. I don't know. I mean, I have been worried about Trump's interest in a deal with Russia. The way in which he greeted Putin was utterly disgusting in Alaska from a simple just knowing what Putin has done. But on the other hand, I also wrote about Henry Kissinger, who met with people who had a lot of blood on their hands too. So I know that's not an unusual thing in diplomacy. But I do think Putin may have finally triggered Trump, and I'm hoping that in that sense there might be things going on that might lead to a resurgence of the Ukrainian aggressiveness against Russia, and perhaps to forcing a settlement.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. Well, talking about Gaza just for a minute, Tom, as you said, it seems like that while maybe it hasn't been a straight line, that the Trump administration has, by the pressure they put on Netanyahu and so forth, has pushed things to more of a peace agreement opportunity. Maybe we're on the verge of one, in fact. Can you just talk a little bit, and then Amy, you as well, about your evaluation of the Trump administration's diplomacy since Trump came into office as it relates to Gaza?
Well, clearly, one of the things Trump did is put the United States wholeheartedly behind Israel. And this was a difference from the Biden administration's more measured approach to Israel and its attempts to even talk about, don't go into Rafah, be actually sort of talking about the Israeli military's efforts in Gaza. So Trump did change policy on that. And at the same time, he also, I think, dealt with many of the Arab countries. I mean, his first big trip abroad was to Arab countries in the region, and actually talking about deals, even with Qatar, getting a jet, an Air Force One of Qatar. So he, in a way, the diplomacy has been sort of confusing. On the other hand, the commitment to Israel and Israel's success as a military hegemon in the region has been extraordinary. The destruction of Hezbollah, the overthrow then of Assad in Syria, and then the neutering of Iran, which I think was crucial. At the same time, of course, Israel has faced an increasing international isolation and attacks on its approach in Gaza. That, of course, has encouraged or created the situation in which the United States has extraordinary leverage over Israel. And Trump has been exercising it lately in forcing Netanyahu, for example, to apologize to Qatar for its strike, and also even telling Netanyahu in a conversation that seems to be accurate that he was too effing negative about the peace agreement with Gaza. And I do think the signals are there in sending his peace envoys, including his son-in-law, there. I think there is going to be an agreement and the hostages will be returned. And I think that does have an opening then for some final, it's not the end because Hamas is a very determined adversary and wants to be there. But I do think that he's lined up many of the Arab states now to some sort of change. And I think there may be in the Middle East this final recognition that there needs to be an end to the war, and that this is the only way to move forward on many of the issues in the Middle East, including, of course, I think, the degree of poverty and backwardness that could be addressed through economic development that would at least be possible in the event of a regional settlement. So I'm cautiously optimistic. The Middle East is a place, though, where American idealism goes to die, where, the disappointments are constant. But there does seem to be something in the air, and Trump's very unusual diplomacy may have produced it.
Thank you. Amy, what are your thoughts on the Trump administration's performance in dealing with Gaza, the situation in Gaza?
So I would credit maybe the media and the international community to being also important catalysts in this process. While most Americans and much of international world opinion 2 years ago very wholeheartedly sympathized and grieved with Israel after the terrorist attacks from Hamas, the resulting widespread devastation, every media image of Gaza that you see now, it's all rubble and starving children, right? So those images, I think, have helped to contribute to the idea that something fundamentally has to change in the Middle East. Being someone who studies the United Nations, the United Nations has been trying to help with the Palestinian situation since 1948, right? Has supported through the UN RWA generations of Palestinians who have been in this sort of in-between state. We thought in the 90s that maybe Gaza and the West Bank could be the two-state solution that the United Nations had recommended in the 40s. The billions of dollars that donors and the United Nations and other nations have put into building Gaza and the West Bank, now lies in rubble. Maybe that's a good place to start from scratch. Maybe there's a way forward that maybe we have some place, sort of rock bottom. Maybe we can build a new foundation moving forward, but at tremendous cost.
Right. Thank you. Well, turning now to Iran, which is fascinating to me. I mean, I was not surprised, of course, that Israel decided to bomb some of their nuclear facilities. I was a little surprised the United States jumped in like they did. And I guess I'm a little surprised that after that has happened, at least in the media, there's been very little discussion coming out of the Trump administration. It seems like there's been very little discussion about next steps and so forth and so on. I guess the Iranian government hasn't said much. And I was a little bit bothered by the Trump administration's seeming attempt to, if not falsify, propagandize a little bit the intelligence about how much damage was done to the nuclear facilities and so forth. But Amy, starting with you, from an American diplomatic perspective, how do you think the Trump administration has done since they came into office? And where do you think this situation evolves over the next few months?
I'm actually going to pass on this. I do not have much expertise when it comes to U.S.-Iranian relations and the intelligence surrounding that.
Okay. Tom, do you have some thoughts?
I do. I think one of the reasons there's been relatively little is the Iranian regime is on its heels in some ways. This is a regime that has driven the country into economic disaster. It's a regime that has set up this ring of resistance around Israel that has been destroyed now largely, except for the Houthis, I suppose. And I think, I think the Iranian state has incredible potential, but the theocracy that has led it has been horrific in terms of what it has done to the resources of that state. And I think, obviously, this is not a situation in which we can talk about regime change. But obviously, I think a regime change in Iran would be tremendously beneficial. Not that it's going to happen overnight, but I do think the Iranian regime has been put back, and it's been a terrorist regime in many respects, one of the foremost backers of terrorism. They've tried to kill people in the United States frequently. I think this has been one of the few areas where I've agreed with the administration taking as strong a stance against it. I think it's a regime that should head to the end of history. But it's obviously it's not there yet. It still has the enormous security apparatus. It's imprisoned thousands. But I think one reason for the Israeli success was because there is such discontent within Iran that they could have many agents there and be able to target much of the leadership. And I think it is a regime that has been humbled and set back, and I hope it brings some type of change. Maybe the change will be a gradual one within the theocracy. Khamenei can't live forever unless he gets all of the organ transplants that Xi and Putin were talking about. I don't think he's going to be there forever, and maybe that there will be change when he's gone, and that's, I think, one of the more I hope will happen.
Thank you. I do think, I do wonder that Iran is a place, it seems to me, that the Trump administration has gone an entirely different direction, or pretty much an entirely different direction, at least in terms of their aggression, than previous administrations have. And that so far seems to be having and I'm talking about going back even to Soleimani, that so far that aggressiveness seems to be, as you described well, a positive impact from not only from an America's perspective, but from the Middle Eastern perspective, from Israel's perspective, from a peace throughout the Middle East perspective, tentatively, maybe.
Well, it's not, it's not a comforting thought, but I think the Iranian regime really was engaged in an effort to destroy Israel, to weaken the United States. It was part of the axis of resistance powers with Russia, China, and North Korea, and it has been the one that's been most weakened by the administration. Now, I'm not, obviously, there, there are other priorities too, but I think um, the fall of the Syrian government, for example. The administration, what we haven't talked about is one of the things the Trump administration's done that's kind of interesting is try to deal with Syria. It could have taken a very standoffish approach because the leader of Syria is a former al-Qaeda figure, and they could have said that we can't deal with it, but Trump met with him and engaged with him. And, if you bring Syria into the Middle East peace equation with Egypt and Jordan and then possibly Lebanon, you've really changed the situation in the Middle East. Israel's borders would then be secure, and you'd have a real opportunity for regional change. So I think on that score, certain progress has been made. But again, everything you say about the Middle East, you have to always add a caveat that it could all unravel tomorrow. So,
yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Okay, well, turning to Europe for a minute, one of the things about the Trump administration that bothers me the most, although that may be just because I'm too traditional and not as open to new diplomatic ideas as I should be and so forth, but that is the administration's, if not dismantling, certainly roughing up our alliances, both with NATO and the Quad and our relationships with Japan and South Korea. He just is taking an entirely different tact, and he may, in fact, be pursuing an entirely different strategy that General Mattis and others have talked about how important, they've talked on the Vanderbilt campus, how important alliances are. And yet, even though there's a little bit of back and forth, that does not seem to be a stalwart of American foreign policy that President Trump believes in. And Amy, starting with you, do you share similar concerns, or do you think that he has gotten, as Tom said, the Europeans to increase, or at least say they're going to increase their defense spending and so forth. So it's working here and there, but how do you evaluate this from a diplomatic standpoint? And I guess from a cost benefit standpoint a little bit as well. And Amy, could we start with you on that?
Yeah, from a historical perspective, these have been some of the strongest alliances that we've had. And if a slight increase in military spending is the benefit, and the cost is eroding a sense of trust and connectedness that has taken 75 years to develop, I obviously would think that the benefit is not outweighed by the cost. Friends, family who have traveled to Canada, to Europe in recent time, talk about how can we sort of long-term trust the United States as a solid diplomatic, economic, even cultural sort of partner. I think that affinity that took a long time to build, Europeans haven't always thought kindly of the United States, were involved the United States in its international affairs, working with the United States through the United Nations, through countless international organizations. That sort of trust has been deeply eroded, and I don't know. We don't know, of course, the long-term cost that might be, but certainly over the short term, a small economic benefit versus, that long-term relationship, I think it's been devastating to those relationships.
Thank you. Tom, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, the one thing I would add is if you look at the situation the United States faces in the world, and you make the case that its primary rival, competitor, and possible enemy is China, the United States will both need the Europeans in that struggle, but it'll also need the Europeans to do more for themselves. There's no, I mean, if the United States does turn, if we ever do make the pivot to Asia that Barack Obama announced back in 2009 or 2010, we're going to need Europe to be stronger in defense. And so, although I'm not totally sure they'll ever meet the 5%, it's at least a start, because remember, they hadn't even met 2%. And then the 3% was the goal, and now it's 5%. So that there is this recognition that Europe needs to, that these are advanced economies that can afford to defend themselves much more significantly than having the United States provide that defensive shield. And so I think the one positive, I don't like the way Trump deals with allies. I mean, the style of Donald Trump is not something that, I mean, you kindly described yourself, Breck, as traditionalist. I'm Eber traditionalist in the sense of my own work on NATO and all the rest. I understand how difficult it was to shape these alliances and how important they are. His style has been terrible in many respects and all of that. But I think the larger strategic issue of reorienting the United States, or at least recognizing that the United States does not have, and here I'm going to make a pitch for my own hobby horse, which is the domestic basis of foreign policy, that there is, I think, obviously a significant number of Americans who no longer believe in America's global role and want to cut back, and that is also there, that any political leader, not just Donald Trump, has to take own awareness of. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to make an argument to those Americans that other countries are doing more. And I think that one good thing that could come out of the Trump administration's role would be that it may end up convincing many people who are much more hostile that now the Europeans are doing something, and so that we can engage because we have activated that. We have activated a more independent defense orientation of Europe, but we can also then use that to bolster defense in Asia. And so I think if that's the result, that's good. I obviously worry about the fraying of the alliances, but I also think Europe has really the European Union, which was this wonderful Kantian peace area, now understands that it can't exist independently of or it can't solely exist as an island of peace when it's got Vladimir Putin on its borders. It has to do more, and that I think is a good thing. And we may benefit from the fact that Putin has been so aggressive that he has finally forced both the United States and Europe to realize, as much as they complain against each other, that they really do need each other. So I am modestly hopeful that this is, but there's going to be a lot of bumps in the road ahead. And again, as I say, I think that's the degree to which China is also looming out there as an issue where we both need the Europeans, but we also need them to do more, is also there.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
if
you.
I could just jump on
Please.
that and pivot back to Tom's discussion of Syria. So maybe one of the positives of having a less activist foreign policy in terms of expecting other countries to do sort of their share or take care of things. In Syria, the president's decision to sort of welcome the new leader of Syria, maybe we could see that as a focus on letting countries sort of develop their own leaders and maybe nationalist leaders, and let some of the labels go away that some people would argue we failed to do, for example, in Vietnam, recognizing Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist versus a communist shaped decades of U.S. foreign policy. Maybe it could be less intervention in those types of affairs, and sort of seeing how things play out, allowing maybe a broader range of outcomes coming out of such situations could be a positive long term.
Good points. Thank you. Well, sticking with Tom's subject area of the influence of domestic opinion, political opinion on foreign policy, and talking about tariffs for a minute, to me, to the American public, they hear these arguments that are pro-tariff, that we're running big balance of payment deficits with all of these countries, and we shouldn't be. And we're also hurting our own domestic industry when we allow excessive free trade. But there clearly is a geopolitical cost to that. There's a balancing. And can you all give sort of give an idea of how you think about that might be helpful to some of the audience in balancing economic concerns with geopolitical concerns, and help people sort of determine how they should think about tariffs and bringing the geopolitical aspect into their thought process. Amy, if that's okay, can we start with you on that?
Sure. There's a long history, right, from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, into the World Trade Organization. The United States has, across that entire arc, believed that making sort of concessions on things like agricultural, sort of low-end raw materials has allowed the United States at the high end, international property, financial services is one of our huge sort of exports at this point, has allowed the U.S. to benefit at a higher level or on higher sort of quality goods compared to others. And it's always been a years-long process whenever there was sort of a tinkering with those, the Kennedy round of GATT. And so, that the entire international community was negotiating, deciding, making those decisions. This is a fundamental unbalancing of that sort of system. It has financial as well as geopolitical consequences for the nations that are involved with it. And ultimately, again, when we're balancing things like the cost of lumber coming into Canada versus being able to maintain one of the largest open borders that doesn't require the same, level of personnel, I don't think we've done a good job of thinking about it's not a single thing, a tariff, a single import, but it really is a system that gives us lots of benefits. There are costs too. There are things that in those negotiations we agree, like, well, we're paying maybe a little bit more than we think we should, but we're also getting this. So understanding that tariffs and financial regulation is generally a negotiation with many elements and variables rather than just it's this and it's this.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Tom?
I think one of the things that came out of World War II was that the United States allowed its defeated enemies access to its market, and Japan particularly recovered economically because it could trade with the United States on terms that were actually quite favorable to the Japanese at times. And in that sense, the United States has bolstered the world economy by keeping its markets more open. That's had consequences for us. China's rise in the 1990s and 2000s may have had an impact. I think there are many factors involved with the decline of manufacturing in the Midwest and some of the Rust Belt issues here in the United States. I think there are usually people who gain from tariffs. There are those who suffer. As I mentioned, the soybean farmers, they had this great market in China. They were able to sell their goods, American agricultural. And when Trump started talking tariffs, China stopped buying. And now there's this enormous amount of soybeans that are going to have to be subsidized and paid for. Those farmers, many of whom are in the states that Trump carried and are politically more red states, and they're going to end up being subsidized by the money that was collected in tariffs, which again seems strange. And I do think the economic policies, particularly the Liberation Day concept of applying tariffs to Swaziland and all sorts of countries that really had relatively little trade, was nonsense. And, yes, Trump can drive a hard bargain, and trade negotiations often do, but I do think we're going to pay some of the price in tariffs. And like I say, I think if the tariffs do lead, as some of the studies are now showing, to continuing the spike in inflation that has been moderated, But if it continues into the midterms, I think the Democrats are going to take power in Congress, and they're going to be able to restrict and change Trump's, create lots of headaches for him in his last 2 years, to put it mildly. Right now, he has an undivided government, which is an extraordinary opportunity for him to be able to enact policies, and he may lose that as a result of these policies.
The other thing
Thank
that I think is happening with the tariff negotiations and the ways that they have become drawn out, the president argued that he was taking this as emergency action because, as Tom pointed out, the Constitution very clearly gives Congress the right to sort of set tariffs. He stepped in and said, we're in the midst of this national emergency that justifies the executive taking these actions. And then the ways in which they have varied and alternated, and the deadlines have changed, and who is participating has really undercut his legal argument that it was such a pressing national emergency that it required executive action as well, because it's still an ongoing process that seems to speak against that legal justification that he laid out.
Well, thank you. Well, let me ask one more question and get your all's opinion on this. There've been, I think at least, several commentators on the Trump administration, some of whom say that the Trump administration is oriented towards sort of dividing up the world among the great powers, with everybody being responsible for their area. I guess what I would call collusion with the people that with nations that have historically been our adversaries. And others say that that's all maybe part of a little bit of a strategy that, in fact, President Trump intends, as I think has been the general orientation in the post World War II period, to be very competitive with our adversaries, especially in red line areas. Not that we don't enter into arms control agreement and trade agreement and reward what we would see as positive behavior and try and deter negative behavior, but that it's competition against our adversaries. Do you all think that the Trump administration has an orientation there, or is it much more ad hoc what's going on with regard to how he views our relationships, for example, with China and Russia? Amy, shall we start with you?
I don't know. So I haven't seen, and I certainly have not heard a policy address from the Trump administration, right, that lays out a clear sort of argument for what exactly is the place of the United States in the world, how Americans will benefit from the initiatives he's taken. And he's never been a, sort of big picture policy enunciation type of president. He simply hasn't. But I don't know. Again, as historians, we're kind of like to wait 23 years and read all the documents and then figure it out.
Good point. Tom, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it has been suggested that the Trump administration was really interested in the old-fashioned idea of spheres of influence, namely the United States, the Western Hemisphere, which was supposedly Franklin Roosevelt's approach too, would dominate here. We would allow Russia and Western Europe, Russia would have its own sphere, China. I think if that's I don't think Trump has that. So I go on the ad hoc thing. If he was trying to get a sphere of influence in Latin America, they're doing a terrible job of it, particularly because China is making all sorts of inroads into Latin America through its trade policies and the rest, and we're alienating those countries. If we're trying to do a sphere of influence in Europe, the backing of the Ukraine, the switch shows that's not going to work. And then in Asia, I think, that may be one area where Trump is at least putting out the idea with China that there could be a sphere of influence. But I don't think, I think that's unlikely. I think the whole problem with spheres of influence is countries just don't want to be necessarily losing that autonomy and forced into it. And I think we're going to see a much more ad hoc approach that Trump will take, seeking his Nobel Peace Prize. He's going to try and intervene where he thinks he can. It's hard to find a larger coherence to this foreign policy, and I think in some ways we're going to the legacy of the Trump administration will be a very fractured one, and we'll be trying to figure it out for quite some time.
Well, thanks. Well, I think our time is up, unfortunately, but I do want to thank Professor Sayward and Professor Schwartz very much for coming. This has been very interesting for me, and I'm sure it has been and will be for audiences who see this. So thanks for your participation today, very much, the both of you. And
Thank you.
I would say on behalf of the Tennessee World Affairs Council that just to reiterate that all of the discussion today were represented the opinions of the three of us, and not at all the Tennessee World Affairs Council, which is a nonpartisan organization that likes to present both sides to most questions. Anyway, thank you all very much. It was great fun for me. I appreciate you all doing this, and see you soon.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.